5 native campers vanished in the summer of 2008, and for 12 long years their disappearance would remain one of the most haunting mysteries in the Bitter Creek Plateau. They were not just names in a missing persons file. They were friends, family, and community members, bound together by a shared love of the outdoors and the wild, unpolished beauty of their ancestral lands. That summer was hotter and drier than anyone could remember. Creeks that usually ran clear and fast were reduced to shallow trickles, and the tall grasses on the plateau stood brittle and yellow under the relentless sun. Even in those dry months, the wind carried a strange coolness when it came from the limestone cliffs. Locals said the caves that pocked those cliffs breathed in the heat, exhaling cool, damp air from deep below the earth. The 5, Darren Cole, Leah Whitecloud, Maya Spotted Horse, Daniel Greyhawk, and Eli Redpath, had grown up together on the Red Elk Nation. This trip was supposed to be an adventure, a change from their usual camping spots near the river. They had talked for years about exploring the lower Bearfang Caverns, a cave system less traveled and far more dangerous than the tourist-friendly ones. Darren, 32, had worked as a park guide and knew the terrain better than anyone. Leah, 27, was a schoolteacher who found freedom in the wilderness and had a knack for navigation. Maya, 29, carried her Nikon D80 everywhere, determined to document what lay beneath those cliffs. Daniel, 34, was the kind of man who could fix anything with a bit of rope and a wrench, and Eli, 28, was the group's source of constant jokes and endless optimism, especially around a campfire. They loaded Leah's Subaru Outback with 2 large green canvas tents, climbing ropes, propane stoves, lanterns, spare batteries, and 2-way radios. Each tent could sleep 3, giving them extra room for gear. Daniel insisted on bringing his bright orange climbing helmet plastered with old stickers from past adventures. Maya's camera was always within reach, her spare lenses wrapped carefully in cloth. Before leaving, Darren checked the weather. Clear skies for the week, with no sign of storms. It seemed perfect. By mid-morning on July 15th, they had driven beyond the last ranger checkpoint and onto a dirt road that wound toward the cliffs. The Subaru kicked up clouds of dust as they passed the scattered juniper trees and weathered fence posts. The road ended at a flat clearing with just enough space to pitch camp. Beyond that, the land dropped sharply into a tangle of gullies and rock shelves, the jagged mouth of a cave visible in the distance. They spent the afternoon setting up camp, the tents neatly staked, the gear arranged in an orderly cluster between them. Maya took photos of everything. The tents glowing green under the sun, Leah and Darren bent over a map spread on a cooler, Daniel adjusting his helmet strap, and Eli balancing on a log, pretending to scout the horizon. As the sun began to dip, the cliffs turned gold, and the wind picked up. That night, they cooked chili over the propane stove, the smell drifting into the cooling air. The sound of their laughter carried across the plateau. From where they sat, the cave opening looked like a dark keyhole in the pale stone. It was bigger than they'd expected. They planned to explore it in the morning, maybe follow it a few hundred meters in and map what they could. The deeper sections, according to Darren, were uncharted. That didn't seem to bother anyone. If anything, it made the trip more exciting. The last confirmed sighting came at sunrise the next day. A solo hiker named Alan McRae, out early to photograph the cliffs, spotted them near the cave entrance. He remembered the scene vividly. Darren adjusting the straps on his heavy pack, Leah kneeling over a folded map, Maya crouched with her camera, and Eli holding a coffee mug in one hand while waving with the other. Daniel stood slightly apart, securing rope to a metal anchor. McRae thought they looked eager, but also strangely focused. He would later tell investigators that the air near the cave felt different, cooler, and with a faint earthy scent that reminded him of wet stone. Shortly after noon, the Red Elk Ranger Station received a final radio transmission from Daniel. The signal was weak, the words faint but clear enough. "We're going in deeper. Should be back before dark." They never came out. When night fell and their campsite remained empty, the first hints of worry began to creep in. The Subaru was still parked in the clearing, both tents neatly zipped, personal items left untouched. The lanterns sat in their places, batteries still inside. It looked like they had simply stepped away for a short hike, not vanished into the earth. The radios were silent, the batteries still holding a charge. A ranger named Paul Kavanaugh hiked out to the cave entrance around 10 p.m. that night. He shouted their names into the dark, his voice echoing back at him from somewhere deep inside. There was no answer, only the soft sound of air moving through the cavern, like the slow breath of something sleeping far below. By sunrise on July 17th, the search had begun in earnest. Teams of rangers, volunteers, and tribal police fanned out across the plateau. They rappelled into side entrances, combed the surrounding gullies, and marked every potential trail on the map. Dogs were brought in, but grew agitated near the cave, whining and refusing to enter more than a few meters. For days, rescuers followed every lead. Footprints in the dust that faded into rock, a scrap of paper that turned out to be unrelated, the distant sound of something clattering deep underground that no one could trace. But there was no sign of Darren, Leah, Maya, Daniel, or Eli. As the weeks passed, the plateau grew quiet again. The tents and gear were recovered and stored. Leah's Subaru was eventually towed back to her family. And the cave, its wide mouth gaping against the cliff, remained untouched by anyone except the wind. The official search ended after 3 weeks. Unofficially, family members and friends kept coming back, leaving offerings at the entrance: a necklace, a framed photo, a folded blanket. Nothing changed. The 5 had walked into the earth and vanished. The first winter after the disappearance came early to the Bitter Creek Plateau. Snow dusted the cliffs in late October, turning the plateau into a monochrome expanse broken only by the black openings of the caves. For the families of Darren, Leah, Maya, Daniel, and Eli, the cold months were a season of stillness and gnawing uncertainty. Even when the snow covered everything, their absence remained raw, like a wound that refused to close. Leah's mother hung a string of prayer ties near the front door, each one bearing a name. Darren's younger brother drove up to the plateau every few weeks, parking near the trailhead, walking to the cave entrance, and leaving a thermos of hot tea and a flashlight, just in case. Local talk about the incident never fully quieted. Some people in Red Elk whispered that the lower Bear Fang caverns had bad medicine, that there were places deep underground where the world turned in on itself, swallowing those who didn't belong. Others leaned on simpler, colder explanations: misjudged distances, sudden injury, a bad fall into an unmapped shaft. But even the most practical voices faltered when reminded that no trace had ever been found. 5 people, seasoned in backcountry travel, all vanishing without leaving so much as a torn scrap of fabric. In early spring 2009, a small group of cavers from Montana heard about the case and offered to map the lower Bear Fang system using new laser equipment. They were experienced, carrying modern gear, but even they came back shaken after 3 days underground. The passages were tight in places, then opened without warning into vast chambers. Some tunnels dropped straight into black voids, with the sound of running water echoing far below. In one chamber, the air felt heavier, as if standing inside a closed room filled with damp stone. The leader of the team, Mark Holloway, told the ranger station they found no signs of the missing campers, but did discover a collapsed section deep in the second chamber, likely the result of seismic activity years earlier. It was possible, he said, that an unseen collapse had cut off part of the cave. If the group had been beyond that point. Holloway didn't finish the sentence. The families held on to that possibility, as brutal as it was. They wondered if, perhaps, the campers had been trapped alive for some time, waiting for help that never came. The thought of their loved ones in darkness haunted every quiet moment. Leah's father stopped going to the community center poker nights. Maya's sister refused to drive past the ranger station, taking a longer route just to avoid the sight of the plateau. By the second anniversary, the case had become part of regional lore. Hikers would pause at the cave mouth and snap photos, tagging them online with captions like "Bear Fang, where 5 vanished." The tourism board hated it, fearing it would scare visitors away, but the name stuck. A local podcaster recorded a 3-part series on the case, interviewing rangers, search volunteers, and Alan McRae, the last known witness. His description of the campers on that morning, their focused expressions, the way Daniel worked the rope into the anchor, played over and over in people's minds. Some claimed they could almost see the scene themselves, like a photograph trapped in time. In 2011, a strange lead emerged. A spelunker from Idaho named Clint Barrett claimed to have found a section of Lower Bear Fang that didn't appear on any map. He described a low tunnel that opened into a narrow shaft, where he saw remnants of what looked like nylon fabric and a piece of metal tubing. His photos, however, were grainy, and investigators could not conclusively match them to the campers' equipment. Still, it was enough to reignite public interest. The tribal council approved a limited search of that area, but once again, nothing tangible came of it. The fabric turned out to be unrelated, likely from a different expedition decades earlier. Over the years, the plateau seemed to reclaim the story. The wind and snow erased footprints. Grass grew over the path to the campsite. The only lasting marks were in the memories of those who had known them. In 2015, a memorial bench was placed at the ranger station, engraved with 5 names. Visitors often left small items on the seat, pine cones, smooth stones, or handwritten notes. One note, left anonymously, read, "We will follow you into the dark if the way opens again." By the 10th anniversary, most believed the truth would never come out. Officially, the case was still open, though no one had pursued new leads in years. Then, in late autumn 2020, an unusually heavy rainstorm swept across the region, pounding the plateau for nearly a week. The limestone cliffs, already riddled with fissures, began to shed rock. On the 3rd night of storms, a section of the Lower Bear Fang's roof collapsed. It was a hiker, ironically another photographer, who first noticed the change when the rain stopped. She'd visited the plateau dozens of times, knew the silhouette of the cliffs by heart, and now saw a fresh scar where stone had fallen away. The debris had exposed a side chamber not visible before. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a shadow in the cliff face, but closer inspection revealed something else. A sliver of canvas, pale and weathered, protruding from a mound of damp earth just inside the opening. The ranger station responded quickly, calling in both tribal police and search and rescue. The opening was unstable, so they worked slowly, shoring up the loose edges before sending in a team. It was there, in that newly revealed chamber, that they found the first definitive link to the 5 missing campers in over a decade. A collapsed space littered with remnants of camping gear, lantern frames, rusted stove parts, and the unmistakable shape of Daniel's orange helmet, the faded stickers still clinging to its surface. The discovery sent a ripple through the community. Families were notified before any public statement was made. Even without full details, everyone knew what it meant. The plateau had kept its secret for 12 long years, and now, piece by piece, it was beginning to give it back. The chamber smelled of wet limestone and something older, like air that had been sealed away for years. Every movement stirred up fine dust that glittered faintly in the narrow beams of flashlight. Sergeant Cole Tallman was the first to duck through the opening, followed by 2 caving specialists from the tribal search unit. They moved with deliberate caution, boots crunching over small fragments of rock, every step measured to avoid dislodging more debris from the unstable roof. Just a few paces in, the walls widened enough for them to stand fully upright. The floor sloped gently downward, leading to a mound of collapsed stone and soil at the far end. It was here that they saw the first weather-stained scraps of fabric, half buried in mud. The pale canvas was so discolored it had taken on the shade of the surrounding limestone, blending into the chamber's shadows until the flashlight's beam caught its edges. Cole crouched and brushed away sediment with the back of his glove, revealing the seam of a tent door zipper. It was still intact, but the teeth were fused with corrosion. They found more as they cleared the debris: twisted aluminum tent poles, bent at odd angles. A camping stove rusted almost to the point of collapse. A collapsed lantern frame with shards of its glass globe scattered across the dirt. Every object they uncovered seemed to carry the weight of years underground. Near the base of the mound, one of the cavers spotted a shape just barely protruding from a gap in the rockfall. It was a climbing helmet, orange once, now dulled to a burnt ochre by time and dust. Cole lifted it carefully, turning it in his hands. Faded stickers still clung to the surface. One of them, a cartoon mountain goat, was peeling at the edges. The initials DJ were scrawled in black permanent marker along the inside rim. There was no mistaking it. The radio crackled faintly as the team outside relayed news to command. Word was already moving back toward the ranger station, though they kept it contained from the public for now. They needed a full survey before anyone beyond the immediate families heard what had been found. The chamber's stillness felt heavy, like the cave itself was listening. Every sound, the scrape of a trowel, the muffled thud of shifting dirt, seemed to vanish into the stone. As they worked deeper, they noticed a second recess behind the main collapse, barely wide enough for a person to pass through. It was blocked by a lattice of rock fragments and roots, as though the ground above had given way and jammed the gap shut. Water trickled faintly somewhere beyond, its echo strange and distant. Cole's instincts told him this was where the rest of the story might be. They marked the location and began carefully extracting loose stone, shoring up the edges with portable bracing. Hours passed in a steady rhythm of clearing and examining. By late afternoon, the bracing was holding, and the narrow gap was just wide enough for a small figure to slip through. Specialist Andrea Holt volunteered, clipping into a safety line and wriggling into the dark space beyond. Her voice echoed faintly as she called back updates. Tight passage, floor uneven, walls damp. Then her tone changed. "I've got more fabric. And something else. Looks like a frame. Metal, maybe from a cot or folding chair. Hold on." Her flashlight beam swept across the small chamber she had entered, revealing 3 collapsed tents in close proximity. One still bore a tribal outfitter's logo on its side, barely visible under grime. Scattered among them were enamel mugs, a cracked plastic storage tub, and a wool blanket that disintegrated at her touch. It was as if the group had been gathered here when the collapse occurred, the rockfall sealing them inside almost instantly. Andrea's voice grew quieter as she examined the scene. "No remains here, not in this section, but—" She trailed off. Cole's shoulders tensed until her voice came back, steadier this time. "There's another drop ahead. It might connect to the lower water system. If they were in that part when the collapse hit—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. When Andrea emerged, her face was pale under a sheen of sweat. She shook her head as if trying to clear the cave's heaviness from her thoughts. The team began documenting the find. High-resolution photos, GPS coordinates, detailed sketches of the chamber layout. Each item was tagged and bagged for later examination, though many were too fragile to move without special preservation equipment. By nightfall, the chamber felt colder. The wind outside had shifted, pushing damp air through the new opening. Kola stood near the entrance, helmet under one arm, staring back into the dark recess. It was the closest they'd been to the truth in 12 years, but the picture was still incomplete. There was no clear sign of how the collapse had happened, or why no one had escaped. The gear suggested they had been alive and settled here before disaster struck, but there were no footprints, no drag marks, no signs of frantic digging from the inside. It was as if the group had simply been still right until the stone came down. As they packed up to leave for the night, Cole took one last look at the helmet with DJ inside. He thought of Daniel's sister, who had once told him she couldn't remember her brother without also remembering his laugh. A deep, unguarded sound that could fill a whole room. It was strange, standing in that silent chamber, to feel that absence so strongly. Somewhere between the cold rock and the scattered gear, the echo of that laugh seemed trapped, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. They sealed the site for the night, posting 2 rangers to guard the entrance until the full excavation crew could arrive in the morning. Outside, the plateau was quiet, save for the rustle of wind through dry grass. The sky had cleared after days of rain, and stars hung low and bright above the cliffs. The investigators walked back toward their vehicles in silence, their breath visible in the chill air. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. The sense that the plateau had opened a door just wide enough to show them a glimpse, before reminding them it still held the rest of the story close. Morning broke cold and clear over the plateau. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass and low shrubs, sparkling faintly in the sun's first light. By the time the excavation crew arrived, breath hung in the air like smoke, and the generator's rumble echoed between the cliffs. Cole stood near the cave mouth, briefing the incoming team on the previous day's findings. He spoke quietly, aware that the sound carried far in the still morning air, and that it felt wrong to raise his voice here. They began by widening the main entrance, cutting away the jagged edges of rock to make room for equipment and personnel. The bracing installed the day before was reinforced with steel struts, each one wedged tight against the shifting limestone. As soon as the first light touched the chamber floor, work resumed on the narrow recess Andrea had explored. The plan was to clear it enough for multiple people to pass through. Slow, methodical work that meant breaking apart slabs of rock that had sat undisturbed for over a decade. Andrea herself led the entry team. They moved deeper into the secondary chamber she'd discovered, cataloging every item in place before shifting anything. The 3 collapsed tents were photographed from every angle, their positions mapped against the chamber walls. The gear around them, mugs, lantern pieces, the shredded blanket, was tagged and noted, even when it seemed insignificant. The smallest details could carry weight in a case this old. At the far side of the chamber, the drop Andrea had mentioned yawned black and damp. It was no more than 6 feet across, but it fell away sharply, the bottom invisible to the naked eye. A faint sound of running water whispered up from the darkness, mingled with a strange, hollow echo that made every voice sound distant. Cole peered over the edge, his flashlight beam tracing slick walls before vanishing into the unseen depths. Ropes were anchored to a pair of drilled bolts, and the first descent was made by a caving specialist named Reuben Clay. His voice crackled over the radio as he counted off his progress. 15 feet, 20, 30. At 32 feet, his boots touched down on a ledge slick with mineral deposits. The air was cooler here, damp enough to condense on his helmet lamp. He described a narrow passage running along the water's edge, its ceiling low and uneven. When Cole joined him, the first thing he noticed was the smell. A stagnant, metallic scent, like old coins left in water. The narrow passage widened after several yards, revealing an underground pool fed by a thin, steady trickle from a fissure in the wall. The surface was still, its depth impossible to judge in the dim light. On the far side, the roof sloped down toward another pile of rockfall, smaller than the one above. Half buried in that rubble was the first clear human trace since the helmet the day before. A hiking boot, its leather blackened with age and mineral stains, laces still tied. Cole's breath caught as he knelt beside it, brushing away the fine silt that coated the surrounding rock. Just beyond the boot, a curve of pale bone emerged from the debris, the texture unmistakable even under the film of cave dust. The team froze for a moment, instinctively lowering their voices. In the narrow beam of light, the partial skeleton seemed both fragile and immovable, as if the stone itself had grown around it. More careful clearing revealed the remains of two individuals, their positions suggesting they had been close together when the collapse happened. One still had a tattered strap across the ribcage, perhaps from a backpack. The other's arm lay outstretched toward the pool. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, every bone measured and marked. The remains would stay in place until forensic specialists could recover them intact. For now, the goal was documentation. Alongside the skeletal fragments, they found a pocket knife, its blade half open, and the warped metal lid of a cooking pot. Time and pressure had bent both almost beyond recognition. Andrea, who had followed them down, stood near the waterline, scanning the far wall. Her beam caught on something embedded in the stone, a patch of bright color that didn't belong. When she climbed up for a closer look, she found it was the corner of a nylon sleeping bag, its fabric fused to the rock by years of mineral buildup. Inside, tucked deep enough to be protected from the worst of the collapse, was a small metal tin. It rattled faintly when shaken. Cole opened it with deliberate care. Inside, protected by the rusted lid, were a handful of personal items. A student ID card for a young man named Mason Littlebear, a faded photograph of 5 smiling campers standing in front of a forest trailhead, and a strip of waterproof matches. The faces in the photograph were unmistakable, the same ones that had stared out from the missing persons flyers 12 years earlier. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow drip of water into the underground pool. In Cole's mind, the case had just shifted. These weren't just traces. They were the voices of the lost, speaking through what they had carried. And if 2 of them were here, there was a chance the rest were close by. They marked the site and began probing the edges of the collapse for signs of passage. Small voids in the rubble suggested there could be connected pockets beyond, perhaps even another chamber. But the work would be dangerous. The rock here was unstable, and the waterline suggested seasonal flooding that could erase evidence in hours. As they prepared to haul their gear back to the surface, Cole stood by the skeletal remains, the tin still in his hand. He thought about the photograph inside, the way the 5 campers had leaned into each other, unaware of how little time they had left. Tomorrow, they would return with a larger team and heavier equipment. Tomorrow, they might find the rest. Outside, the sun was already slipping behind the cliffs, and the plateau was sinking into shadow. The cold deepened quickly, the air sharpening with every breath. The cave mouth loomed behind them like a silent witness, its dark interior holding the unanswered questions of 12 years. Coley knew they were closer than ever, but he also knew this place wasn't done resisting. The next morning came with a leaden sky, the air heavy with the scent of approaching rain. The crew moved quickly, aware that even a modest storm could raise the underground water level and set their progress back weeks. The walk across the plateau felt different now. Every footstep toward the cave carried the weight of knowing they were no longer chasing shadows. They had real evidence, real remains. By 7 a.m., the mouth of the cave glowed with the light of headlamps and floodlights. Steel braces groaned as they absorbed the weight of the limestone above. Inside, the previous day's descent ropes still hung taut, their knots damp from the night's condensation. Cole adjusted his harness, feeling the familiar constriction around his chest, and dropped into the dark once again. Andrea was already below, reviewing the mapping notes from yesterday. The plan was straightforward. Expand the safe zone around the skeletal remains, then push deeper through the smaller rockfall that hinted at another chamber. A 3-person team began the careful work of lifting away chunks of stone no heavier than a few pounds, large enough to matter structurally, small enough to handle without shifting the pile dangerously. Every piece moved was examined for signs of human contact. The faint scrape of a knife blade on one rock, the trace of old soot on another, tiny details that might help reconstruct the campers' final days. An hour in, a breakthrough came. As Reuben eased away a slab the size of a chair cushion, a narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for a crouched person to slip through. Cool air drifted from it, fresher than the stagnant damp of the chamber they were in. Cole went first, squeezing into the gap with his pack slung sideways. His light swept across a small space, no more than 12 feet across, but the floor was cluttered with objects dulled by dust and mineral crust. At the center lay the partial frame of another tent, collapsed but still holding its shape enough to recognize. The nylon was the same faded green as the others, and the seams were frayed, as if chewed by rodents long ago. A foot away from the tent's entrance, the third set of remains lay curled on its side, knees tucked toward the chest. The bones here were better preserved, shielded from the worst of the moisture. Around the waist, a belt pouch sagged with weight. Inside, they found a compass, its needle still swinging freely, and a folded topographic map marked with ink circles, locations that corresponded to nearby caves and streams. Andrea crouched beside the find, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "They were trying to navigate," she murmured, "even down here." Near the chamber's far wall, an enamel camping mug rested on its side, its handle snapped. Inside were 3 spent shell casings, each tarnished but intact. The caliber matched a small hunting rifle, not found among the remains so far. Whether it had been carried deeper into the cave or lost in the collapse remained unknown. The search continued toward a dark cleft in the rock. Here, the floor dipped slightly, and the crunch underfoot shifted from stone to something softer. Cole knelt, brushing away the silt to reveal strips of waterlogged fabric. The 4th camper's remains emerged gradually, partially pinned beneath a collapsed section of the wall. A rusted multi-tool lay open beside one skeletal hand, its blade locked in place as if it had been gripped until the last possible moment. They worked in silence for several minutes, the scrape of tools and shuffle of boots the only sounds. Then Andrea's voice, quiet but steady. "We've got more." She was standing at the edge of a shallow pool fed by a thin rivulet from the ceiling. Just beneath the surface, something pale reflected the light. Long bones, partially exposed through the sediment. When they cleared the water and muck, they found the 5th and final set of remains, face down, arms extended toward the slope leading back to the previous chamber. Cole stared at the position for a long time. It suggested movement, an attempt to crawl or reach the others. Beside the body was a waterproof bag, the kind used for canoe trips. Inside were a journal and a small plastic container. The journal's pages were swollen with moisture. The ink bled into faint shadows of itself, but fragments could still be read. The last legible entry was dated September 14, 2008, 3 days after the group had last been seen above ground. The handwriting trembled across the page. Collapse, no way out, food almost gone, we'll try the other side if water drops. The plastic container held a roll of undeveloped film. It had been sealed well enough that, with careful handling, some images might still be salvageable. Cole passed it to the evidence tech with explicit instructions for preservation. By the time they finished, the chamber felt heavier, as though it had absorbed the knowledge of what they'd uncovered. The 5 were no longer just a list of names on an old case file. They were here, their final moments etched into the stone and silt. Back at the surface, rain had begun to fall in fine needles, beating on jackets and gear. The plateau smelled of wet sage and cold limestone. The crew worked quickly to secure the site, covering the entrance with tarps and weighted edges to keep the water out. Tomorrow, the forensic team would begin the painstaking process of lifting each set of remains for transport. As Cole stood at the edge of the bluff, looking down over the winding valley, he thought of the map found in the belt pouch. The circled points marked other places, other caves that the group might have explored before disaster struck. If this was where they had been found, the path that led them here might still be hidden in the hills, waiting to be traced, and tracing it would be the next step. The rain had turned steady by the time the forensic transport vans pulled away from the site. Inside, each set of remains was secured in its own evidence container, the bags sealed and labeled with both GPS coordinates and chamber designations. The 5 containers rode silently in the back, accompanied by 2 members of the recovery team, their eyes fixed forward as the road unwound through the plateau. At the temporary command post in town, the artifacts were first in line for processing. A mobile lab unit, parked just behind the courthouse annex, had been outfitted with humidity-controlled cabinets for drying the damp clothing and gear. The tents were laid out on tarpaulins, their nylon panels stiff with mineral residue, their poles bent at unnatural angles from years of pressure underground. The colors: 3 faded green, 1 sun-bleached tan, 1 deep blue, were dull but intact enough to be recognizable. Andrea oversaw the intake personally. Each item was photographed, tagged, and cataloged before being moved to the evidence tables. The journal, still swollen with water, was placed in a specialized freeze-drying chamber. The undeveloped film received priority, its canister opened only in the darkroom at the State Crime Lab 2 hours away. By mid-afternoon, the first preliminary forensic report arrived. The bones showed no evidence of pre-mortem trauma, no knife marks, no bullet impacts, no fractures inconsistent with the cave collapse. Instead, the pattern suggested asphyxiation and hypothermia as the most likely causes of death. In several cases, the smaller bones bore fine mineral etching, a sign that they had lain in damp conditions for years before being partially sealed by falling rock. The soil samples told another part of the story. Microscopic pollen grains embedded in the sediment matched species that bloomed in early September, placing the timing of the collapse close to the last journal entry. Even more telling was the presence of soot particles in layers above the bones, indicating that the group had lit fires inside the cave during their entrapment. While Andrea reviewed the forensic findings, Cole waited in the darkroom with the photo technician. The moment the first negatives were developed, the room seemed to tighten with anticipation. The images were grainy, the emulsion degraded at the edges, but many were still intact enough to tell a story. The earliest frames showed the campers in daylight. 5 friends posed beside their tents on the plateau, the mouth of the cave just visible in the background. They were dressed in layered outdoor gear. 2 men in flannel shirts under weatherproof jackets, 3 women in fleece pullovers and knit caps. One woman, identified later as Lila Redbear, was holding a lantern and laughing at something off camera. The next series of shots was taken inside the cave. The group had arranged sleeping bags in a semicircle, their packs stacked neatly along one wall. Candles and headlamps provided the only light. In one photo, a small camp stove was set on a flat rock, a pot of water heating over the flame. Nothing in these frames suggested fear or urgency, only the quiet camaraderie of people settling in for a night below ground. But the tone shifted sharply in the final sequence. The camera angle was lower, the lighting harsher, as though someone had grabbed the camera in a hurry. One image showed a jagged crack running across the cave ceiling, thin streams of dust drifting down. Another captured the group clustered together, their faces streaked with grime, the fire in the center burning low. The last frame was almost entirely black, save for a faint outline of what might have been the rockfall beginning to close off the passage. Cole studied that last photograph for a long time. "They knew," he said quietly. "They knew it was coming." Later that evening, they gathered in the briefing room to consolidate the evidence. The map found in the belt pouch was overlaid with current topographical data. It became clear that the group had been systematically exploring the network of caves in the area. 3 circled locations had already been surveyed in the days before they vanished, and the final circle marked the one where they had been found. Andrea tapped at the table with a pen. "They weren't lost when they came here," she said. "This was their destination." The question now was why. There were no signs of foul play, no indications of being forced into the cave. Every scrap of evidence pointed to an accident, albeit one with an unusually tragic outcome. But one detail continued to nag at Cole: the missing hunting rifle. The spent casing suggested it had been fired 3 times, yet no one had reported hearing gunshots in the area during the time frame. A decision was made to send a small team back to the site in the morning. The goal: trace the water flow inside the cave to determine if it led to another exit, and perhaps the missing weapon. That night, Cole walked alone along the edge of town, the rain having tapered off to a mist. He kept replaying the photographs in his mind, the easy smiles of the first frames dissolving into the shadowed tension of the last. The cave had taken everything from them: light, warmth, air. And yet, in the face of that, they had stayed together. Tomorrow, they would go back into the dark. And maybe, just maybe, the cave would give up the rest of its secrets. Dawn broke gray and cold, the air heavy with the dampness of the previous night's rain. Andrea, Cole, and 3 members of the recovery team stood beside their vehicles at the base of the trail, pulling on harnesses and adjusting helmet lamps. The plan was simple on paper. Follow the streambed inside the cave as far as conditions would allow, then map any additional chambers that had been missed during the initial recovery. But everyone knew that simple, in caving terms, meant nothing when it came to unstable geology. The hike to the cave mouth felt different this time. The once muted greens of the moss and undergrowth seemed darker, as though the forest itself was aware of their intentions. They passed the flagged markers from the first expedition, bright strips of orange fluttering limply in the breeze, and stepped into the shadow of the limestone cliff. The opening yawned ahead, a black mouth against pale stone, edges still crumbled from the collapse years earlier. Inside, their headlamps cut narrow beams through the stale air. The path down to the main chamber had been cleared enough for a careful walk, but the jagged edges of rockfall still jutted like teeth from the walls. Andrea led, Cole behind her, the others spaced evenly for safety. At the rear of the original chamber, the sound of water became louder. It wasn't a steady rush, but an irregular gurgle, like something moving beneath loose gravel. They followed it to a low crawl space, partially blocked by debris. One of the recovery techs knelt, brushing away loose sediment until an opening just large enough for a person to slide through appeared. The air on the other side was cooler and damp enough to cling to skin. Their lights revealed a narrow corridor, sloping gently downward, with a thin stream winding along the floor. Every so often, the beam would catch flecks of mineral shimmer, tiny crystals embedded in the walls. The corridor opened into a secondary chamber, smaller than the first, but still high enough to stand. In one corner, a tangle of driftwood and sediment marked where the water had once pooled during heavy rains. It was there, wedged between two rocks, that Andrea spotted the first anomaly. A length of fabric, mottled with age but still showing a faded camouflage pattern. When she pulled it free, the weight inside told her it wasn't just cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing the rusted barrel of a rifle. The stock was cracked, the metal pitted, but the serial number was still legible. Cole crouched beside her, running a gloved hand over the weapon. "That's the missing rifle from the inventory list," he said, "the one their families always asked about." But there was more. Tucked into the folds of the fabric was a small waterproof pouch. Inside, a crumpled notepad, the paper yellowed but remarkably intact. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the ink faded in places. It wasn't a formal journal entry, more like hurried notes. Sept 9, ceiling shifting, heard second crack at dawn, fire low, trying the other tunnel, rifle just in case, if we don't make it. The sentence cut off abruptly, the last mark a long smear where the pen must have been dragged suddenly. They spent another hour mapping the chamber and its water path, which eventually narrowed into a siphon too tight for safe exploration without scuba gear. On the way back, Cole couldn't shake the thought that the notes implied they'd tried to find another exit. The rifle, it seemed, had been carried along that attempt, perhaps left behind when the collapse made retreat impossible. Outside, the light felt almost alien after hours underground. Andrea bagged the rifle and the pouch separately, tagging them for immediate analysis. Back at the command post, a quick check of the rifle's serial number confirmed it had been purchased by one of the male campers just weeks before the trip. That detail reawakened old rumors, that they'd been armed because they feared something out there. But without signs of external violence, those theories still felt speculative. That evening, Andrea spread the cave maps across the table. The newly discovered chamber was marked in red, along with the siphon passage. "If this was their escape attempt," she said, "it means they knew the main route was collapsing before it happened." Cole leaned over the map, tracing the line from the main chamber to the siphon with his finger. "Or," he said, "someone told them to take this route." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Andrea said, "We need to talk to the last person who saw them before they entered the plateau." 2 days later, a battered pickup truck rolled into the tribal police lot, carrying a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same weathered limestone that framed the plateau. His name was Raymond Tall Elk, 72 years old now, but in 2008 he'd been the seasonal maintenance worker stationed at the Western Ranger Hut, the one the campers had passed on their way into the backcountry. Andrea had spoken to him briefly years earlier, but back then his account was dismissed. The official reasoning had been that his timeline didn't match the established search logs, and that his odd recollections were unreliable. This time, she was determined to hear every detail without interruption. Raymond settled into the interview room chair, hands folded loosely on the table. His eyes were sharp despite the deep creases around them. "You really want to know what I saw?" he asked. "Yes," Andrea said. "Everything." He leaned back. They came by just before dusk, not in a rush, not in trouble, laughing. But they had extra gear, more than you'd expect for 5 campers. He ticked the items off on his fingers. Rope, good climbing rope, a canvas duffel that looked heavy, and 2 waterproof barrels lashed to a sled. "Waterproof barrels?" Cole asked. "Yeah, big ones, the kind you float supplies in if you're crossing a river." I asked them about it, and the tallest guy said they were for stashing things ahead of time. When I asked what, the woman with the red jacket laughed and said, "You'll see." Andrea jotted the details, then asked, "Did you see which way they went?" "They took the old trail, what we call the high cut. It's steeper, narrower, and it skirts the top of the gorge before dropping down toward the sinkhole caves. Most people avoid it because the rock's unstable, but they moved like they'd been there before. And after that? That night, I was out checking a culvert near the stream crossing when I heard what sounded like a deep crack. Not thunder, rock splitting. A minute later, I saw dust in the moonlight coming off the gorge wall. The next morning, I went up that way, but didn't go far. The dust was still hanging in the air. Andrea's pen slowed. "You told the search team this?" "Sure did. They said the gorge wasn't in their primary grid, and by the time they checked it, rain had wiped most traces away. I figured they'd decided it didn't matter." He shrugged. I stopped offering my opinion after that. When they showed him the photo of the recovered tents, he tapped one of them with a calloused finger. "That's the red one. I saw her carrying it on her back. Same mud stain on the side pocket." Back at the evidence board, Andrea rearranged the timeline. Raymond's account placed the campers at the high-cut trail at least 12 hours earlier than the original estimate, and moving toward the gorge, not the lower caves. It also suggested they were transporting something heavy enough to require waterproof barrels, which had never been found. "If the collapse we know about wasn't the only one," Cole said, "then maybe part of the gorge gave way before they even reached their main site." Andrea looked at the cave map again, the red-marked siphon chamber. "Or those barrels are still in there somewhere, past that siphon." The recovery team's hydrology specialist joined them later that afternoon with new data. Heavy rains in the spring of 2009 had likely caused a partial flush of the lower cave network, explaining why some remains and gear had been shifted into the collapsed chamber, while other heavier objects could have been carried deeper into unmapped sections. That night, Andrea stared at the notepad recovered with the rifle. The smeared final line seemed more urgent now, as if the decision to try the other tunnel was not just about escape. It might have been about salvaging whatever they'd brought in those barrels. She closed her eyes and imagined the group huddled in the dark, dust sifting down from the ceiling, deciding whether to wait for rescue or push deeper into unknown passages. In the end, something, fear, stubbornness, or obligation, had driven them forward. By the next morning, she had made up her mind the siphon would be the next objective. 2 weeks later, the team stood at the mouth of the siphon tunnel. The water was as cold as glass, its surface trembling with the faint pulse of the underground current. Andrea checked her gear while the dive lead, Carter Voss, reviewed the safety plan one last time. Beyond that narrow, water-filled passage lay the unmapped section of the cave system, a place no one had entered since the collapse. The dive was slow, claustrophobic. Visibility dropped to near zero when the silt clouded, and the passage twisted in ways that seemed designed to snag tanks and hoses. Andrea kept one hand on the guide rope, the other on her dive light, scanning for any sign of human disturbance. At one point, The tunnel widened just enough for her beam to catch something ahead, the faded nylon of a tent bag wedged in a crack. By the time they emerged into the chamber beyond, the air smelled stale, untouched. Their lights swept across the uneven floor, revealing an eerie tableau. 2 large blue waterproof barrels, one still sealed with a corroded clamp, the other split open, spilling out camping gear, sleeping bags, cookware, and a half-disintegrated journal. Nearby, against the rock wall, lay the collapsed frame of a tent and the rusted skeleton of a climbing stove. Andrea's gloves trembled slightly as she lifted the intact barrel. It was heavier than she expected. When they cracked it open at base camp hours later, the contents made everyone fall silent. Inside were laminated topographic maps with hand-marked routes, a waterproof pouch of cash in multiple currencies, and a smaller barrel within a barrel containing what appeared to be raw mineral ore. Dark, metallic, flecked with silver veins. Carter looked at her. This wasn't just camping gear. The journal from the split barrel provided more context. The earliest entries described a side objective for the trip, exploring an unrecorded shaft in hopes of recovering samples. Later entries hinted at tension among the group, disagreements over the safety of transporting the material, and whether to hide it for a later retrieval. The final page, dated the day of the collapse, was a frantic scrawl. Tunnel flooding. No way back. Trying new route through lower fissure. If we make it, barrel will stay with camp. Someone must tell. The ink trailed off into an illegible smear. The forensic team later confirmed the mineral was a rare form of argentiferous galena, an ore rich in silver and lead, with potential archaeological significance due to its location. Tribal historians speculated the group might have stumbled upon an old, undocumented mining site, possibly sacred or off-limits. That would explain the secrecy, the altered route, and their decision to carry heavy barrels into unstable terrain. In the weeks that followed, divers recovered partial remains in the same chamber, 3 of the 5 campers, positioned as if they'd been resting near the barrels when the second collapse sealed the tunnel completely. The other 2 were likely lost deeper in the fissures, beyond reach. Andrea stood at the gorge overlook one last time, the wind carrying the scent of pine and limestone dust. The high-cut trail stretched below, its switchbacks vanishing into shadow. She could almost see them, 5 figures moving with purpose, carrying more than just the trappings of a weekend trip. At the small memorial erected near the sinkhole, she placed the recovered journal in a weatherproof case for the families, its warped pages still smelling faintly of the cave. The cache and ore would be cataloged, preserved, and kept under tribal stewardship. The case file, after 12 years, would finally close, not with every answer but with enough to redraw the truth. Driving away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The mouth of the gorge receded into the distance, but the story of those 5 campers, their hidden cargo, and the choice that led them into the dark would stay with her, etched into the stone and the silence of the caves forever.